Greetings, lovers of lore, and a special early greeting to all of my patrons who have early access. Hello, thanks for supporting the channel. It means a lot to me. Now, in the last installment of the Karn lore, they had just kind of retaken the Isle of Teleria and were settling in. As the story continues, Karn spends a number of months after the last installment in the story just kind of living in a normal rhythm of spending his day building different things that need to be built, right? He is a gigantic hulking silver golem, so his brute strength is obviously very useful for helping to smooth out the ground, move massive stones, and additionally, he gets the joy of spending time with his absolute best friend and favorite person in the world, and that is Jhoira, right? I mean, especially when winter rolled around, there wasn't much to do, even in terms of building, so Karn was able to have a little bit of a normal life. Now, this lasted up to a certain point where one day Urza declared that they were going to bring the battle to the Phyrexians in the Gorge, right? So Urza says it is time to mobilize. Now, some of this story is covered over on the Joyra side of it. Like, sometimes dividing up these stories into different characters can be difficult to decide what to put where. So if you want to know how the full Phyrexian Gorge situation goes, you can watch the Joyra storyline. We're going to briefly touch on it here because it's relevant for Karn. So Karn was chosen as part of the ground crew for this expedition. In very rough points, the idea is Urza has created a massive hot air balloon, okay? They're going to float this hot air balloon out over the Phyrexian Gorge, and they're going to drop crazy amounts of charges from the airship to essentially obliterate everything within the Phyrexian Gorge, the fast time rift. Now, Karn's role as part of the ground crew is to help ensure the safety of the crew of the airship. How this works is there are 3 giant tether ropes that are essentially connected down to the earth and are also being held by the members of the ground crew. Now, Karn, being the strongest member of this crew, has the most responsibility. And there's a situation where essentially Karn watches the airship lift off into the air and start to float out towards the gorge as they figure out how the tethers work and to give them enough slack. So the airship floats out above the gorge. Everything seems to be going to plan, right? You can see the charges, or I should say Karn can see the charges dropping out of the airship and landing in the gorge. Things seem to be going apace. There was one fateful moment where it felt like there was going to be a problem as all these harpoons, these ballista bolts fired up out of the gorge towards the airship. However, the engineering of the airship and the amount of time but the amount of altitude they had gained protected them from being struck by those harpoons. So time progresses, everything seems to be going fine, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, from Karn's perspective, for seemingly no reason, the airship just abruptly drops low down, and Karn feels this dread, which is well-founded because a few moments later, the ballista bolts fire up out of the gorge and smash into the airship. This means, obviously, Joyra and everyone else's lives are in grave danger. Karn watches as the ballista bolts smash into the airship and cause a massive explosion. He actually, at a certain point, he is sure that everybody must have been wiped out. But then he can see, climbing along one of the tether ropes, is Jhoira. And Karn is full of hope, basically cheering her on internally, like hoping that she'll make it back. But unfortunately, right before his eyes, the airship gets sucked down into the time rift. The rope that she's on gets pulled taut. She is sent flying, and Karn watches helplessly as the person who matters the most to him in the world sails through the sky and then just strikes down into the ground. So Karn and the ground crew rush over to the wreckage to find, well, I mean, most of the wreckage ends up in the rift, but they go and look for survivors. Now, the only one they can find is Jhoira. Urza has survived the situation because, I mean, let's be real, he has godlike powers. So something like this is not going to wipe him out. But unfortunately, Jhoira has no such abilities, right? Jhoira has long life extended by the slow time water, but other than that, she's a regular mortal. So striking the ground like she did actually put her directly into a coma. Now, they didn't have at this point, they didn't have an infirmary set up at the school. So they have basically, they end up Karn carries Jhoira back to the school, and they turn the kitchen into a makeshift infirmary. They drag Barrin's bed in there, and they place Jhoira down into this bed. Now, Urza spends a whole bunch of magical energy just trying to heal Joyra's body. And he successfully heals her body, but there's something wrong with her spirit. There is no way to get her to awaken out of what's going on. Essentially, she's another Teferi, like within arm's reach, but at the same time unreachable. And for the next 5 years, Jhoira remains in this coma, and it weighs very, very heavily on Karn, right? I mean, he spends his time building like towers, dormitories, halls, all these different buildings as part of the school to help distract himself and give him something to do when he's not focused on Jhoira. But a full 5 years goes by, and whenever he wasn't working on building, he would spend his time going to the Angelwood, which was the paradise that Jhoira had showed them earlier when they showed up on the island. So he would go and collect these wildflowers that specifically were Joyra's favorite, and he would stand over her every night. Instead of deactivating like he used to, he would remain active the entire night and stand over her night after night after night. And during the building of the school, they actually went to the trouble of building a gigantic 2-story infirmary to heal the sick. But the thing is with the fact that most of the students are actually really young and healthy, and the fact that Urza has insanely strong magic, there wasn't actually really a need for the infirmary. It was almost built as a permanent home and a monument to Jhoira. So it's crazy because you have both Jhoira and Teferi who are just locked away, and Karn can't reach either of them. Although, let's be real, I mean, Karn cares about Jhoira way more than he cares about Teferi. So they basically have a setup where Jhoira is being fed through a feeding tube with a magical device that Urza has constructed for that purpose, right? So that's how they keep her fed. They continually give her doses of the slow time water as well, so that she's not aging, but her body is like atrophying from being in the bed here. Basically, Karn is watching her kind of like wither away in front of him, and there's nothing that he can do. And as time progresses, so does Karn's frustration build, right? He's just getting more and more frustrated to the point where and this would extend to other members as well. Urza wasn't as affected, but individuals like Barrin, it got to the point where Karn and Barrin would get into these arguments. Now, Barrin was obviously older and a little more responsible. He's I guess more to blame in this situation because Karn is still relatively young, but he's built up this sense of sarcasm. So on this one enjoyable interaction between them is basically Barrin is complaining about Karn's, like, do you need to be so bright? Could you just let yourself tarnish a little? And Urza, basically Karn says, Urza won't allow me to do that. Actually, I'm specifically ordered not to. However, you know what might help? Maybe it wouldn't bother you if you put a sack on your head. So Karn stepped up a bit in levels of sarcasm. And actually, during this interaction, there is a moment where there is this metallic whining coming out of nowhere, and a gigantic metal falcon comes streaking down out of the sky towards Karn and Barrin. Barrin, wasting no time, pulls out a sword. How often do you hear about a wizard with a sword? And he basically bats at the falcon without much success. It flies away and comes back for another pass, at which point Karn steps forward with this giant metal frame and swings his gigantic fist into this falcon. It falls to the ground, but all of a sudden, all these spikes poke out of it and crazy blades start whirring around. It's just this madness. And so Karn and Barrin are just staring in awe at this thing as Urza walks up and explains to them, this is my new creation. This is what we're going to turn loose on the Phyrexians. It can literally smell it can smell Phyrexian oil. So we're going to send these in to destroy Phyrexia. So the night of the incident with the Falcon, Karn makes a pivotal decision. He's looking down at Jhoira, and she's so small and pale, a ghost of her former self, right? She used to be kind of the wild woman of Teleria with her tanned, leathered skin and like a wiry but muscled frame. She was very much alive. And now she looks like a ghost, and he's been waiting years and years for his best friend to return. The only part of her that wasn't white and pale was the redness around her mouth where the feeding tube was stuck down basically to keep her alive, right? So Karn's looking down at her and he's talking to her. He's telling her about how Teferi, the robe that she has thrown to try and save Teferi from the flames has worked. The flames have been extinguished, so she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. Obviously, not wanting to distress her, he omits the part where he would talk about how now Teferi will try and probably leave the fast time rift, which will lead to slow time rift, I should say, which will lead to his ultimate destruction. So while he's looking down, he's thinking about the fact that new students are arriving to the school. The Tolarian Academy is actually finished at this point. The whole school has been built. There is no real purpose for Karn anymore. And more importantly, what of Urza's promises to help Teferi and what's going on with Joyra? They're both essentially being left. And so Karn decided he couldn't take it anymore. So he very carefully leaned over and gently removed the feeding tube from Joyra's mouth. And then he picked her up and he whispered, come with me. And he carried her gently like a child. And as he walked by, other members of the Tolarian Academy see him walking by, and half of them think to themselves that Joyra's life is over and he's actually carrying her off for burial. That's how small she looks, so small and frail. But the other half thought maybe that they had some kind of like cure for her. So there was hope and concern as well. Either way, Karn walked by all of them, giving them no thought. And resolutely, he walked along, carrying her past all of these different time rifts that he was aware of, and through thick forests, all the way across this gigantic sandstone rock to the secret hideaway where she had originally hidden away with Carrick and then lived once everybody had abandoned the Isle of Teleria. Now here, things remain unchanged. It was basically the same as it was originally, which was in a way cathartic for Karn as he wanted to return to the past. So he sat down in that little hideaway and he cradled Joyra's body in his lap. And he basically just talked to her saying, it's time for you to come home. It's time for you to come home. It's time for you to come back. As the salty, warm air just kind of flowed, he moved her out onto the sandstone where she would sun with Darab back in the days when those other survivors of Teleria were with her. And so he said, you said like this is where you would be when your soulmate arrived. Wake up, you've slept too long. And he sat there and there was nothing, no response. And he said, we need you. You, like Urza is going to make the same mistakes he's made before. We need you. You are the soul of this island. You are the soul of what we do, and we need you to return. Otherwise, these young students are just going to get walked down the same path that you have. Now, at this point, he looks down and he can see that her eyelids are fluttering. And she basically mumbled a little, and he leaning in to hear. She basically mumbled, I've dreamed. I've quested. Now, Karn desperately says, what? He doesn't know what's going on, right? But it's too late. Jhoira is unconscious again. Now, Karn, at the same time, he is feeling two different things. There's this perfect stillness where he's frozen in the moment. And inside, there's this thrumming feeling. But he doesn't have a heart. But it would be the same as having like a racing heartbeat, right? So at this point, Karn is sitting there, not even sure that this really happened. Was he delusional? Did Jhoira actually speak to him? Or was it just pure hopefulness on his part? So he takes Jhoira back to the school, explains it to Urza and Barrin. Now Urza comes and gives her his healing touch every single day. but it's not making a single difference. It's not changing anything. The only one that she responds to at all, the only way to get any kind of response is through Karns, like quietly talking to her and just kind of like gently touching her while she's laying there. So after a week later after that initial incident at her hideaway, she regained consciousness for a moment, enough to say, I know how to save us. I know how to save Teferi. Now, after that incident, basically Karn abandoned all other duties. He refused to have anything to do with any task that wasn't Jhoira related. And he stayed with her for the next 6 months, where she slowly but surely improved little by little to the point where she was able to remain conscious for multiple minutes per hour. So her situation improved and improved until she finally reached the point where she was able to draw out these schematics for a device. She had a vision, and in that vision had come up with the concept for a magical device that could be used to save Teferi. Now, we'll go into detail specifically about all the different aspects of that device in Joyra's storyline, as it seems more appropriate there. We're just going to touch on it briefly here. So she spends the time sketching out the device schematics. Once that's all done, Karn starts to round up a bunch of new students who have come to the school, because Urza doesn't seem to have any interest in the project. Anytime Jhoira tries to explain it to anybody other than Karn, they just think that essentially she has brain damage from the fall outside of the airship, right? So they won't take her concept seriously. But Karn, being her best friend and very devoted to her, takes it upon himself to go out, round up all these students, and get them working together to create Joyra's magical artifact device that's going to be used to save Teferi. So it took a full 3 months for them to finish the construction of the device. But once it was successfully constructed, they gathered outside by Teferi Shrine, which is obviously the slow time rift that Teferi is trapped in, and they set the device up. Now, as they were setting the device up, there was some serious issues brought to the forefront. First of all, the biggest issue was brought up by Barrin, and that is that the device has been untested on living beings. So it's basically like, look, you just essentially dreamed up this device, and we don't know if it's going to work. We need to spend some time doing testing on animals. Now, obviously, Jhoira is ready to go. She wants to do this immediately. Karn as well wants to he's like, let's make this happen. Let's not wait. But Barrin, he's a higher ranking individual, right? I mean, the only person above Barrin is Urza. So if Barrin says something, the only way to get around that is going to be if Urza overrules him, which is actually what happens in this scenario, essentially. I mean, first what happens is Barrin places his objection, saying, you have not tested this on the living. At this point, Jhoira kind of sags down in defeat, right? She doesn't have that much energy. She doesn't feel like she can fight against Barrin in this situation. Now, Karn says, look, I was made to endure temporal stress. Like, my body was literally designed for magical time travel. So I volunteer to go in there. Absolutely no problems. Like, send me in. Now, at this point, Barrin goes, you know what, that's a great idea, except here's the problem. You can go in, sure, and you can come out probably with no problem. However, you can't bring Teferi with you. His body will not survive the stress. He will be destroyed. And at this point, that's when Urza speaks up and says that he will go as well. And so there's nothing to be concerned about. And at that point, even though Barrin has more concerns, there's nothing he can do to override Urza. Now, Urza and Karn start to discuss their plan about what they are going to do, and they tell them to activate the device, because Urza has stated that he believes in the machine. He's looked at it, he feels like this magical artifact is well designed, and he's willing to go on this risky, I mean, he's a planeswalker, so let's be real, the risk is lower to him. However, these time rifts are still strong enough that they could theoretically destroy or trap a planeswalker. So this is not without risk for Urza. So they start to power up this device, and as they power it up, the rift starts to fill with a little bit of mist. It starts to slowly coalesce with mist. Now, as this mist is forming, Karn and Urza are hashing out the details of how they're going to do this. Karn offers to go first. I can go into the rift first and report back to you. It's what we've been doing all along. Now, Urza says, no, we're going to go together, creator and creature, shoulder to shoulder. So they wait as the device does its thing. The mist inside the rift starts to coalesce into a gigantic, thick wall of fog. And it's swirling around, but with this kind of crazy, slowish motion as well, because this is an extreme slow time rift. And shoulder to shoulder, Karn the Silver Golem and Urza Planeswalker step into the rift and the unknown. All right, my friends, well, that was this installment of the Karn story. I hope you enjoy it very much. Next time, we will cover what happens inside the rift and all that goodness, so make sure you come back for that. If you want to support the channel and make sure I keep making awesome lore videos, hopping on the Patreon is the absolute best way to do it. You'll be like the people whose names are scrolling by now, and you get early access to the lore videos. So, thanks for coming by. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And remember, my friends, lore is life.